She walked into the Pentagon with a classified folder tucked under her arm, her name on every page inside it, and not a single soul in that room knew it yet. Here is exactly what happened. At a high-security Pentagon briefing for Operation Iron Hawk, a decorated SEAL colonel named Richard Harmon publicly humiliated Commander Nadia Reyes in front of a room full of senior military officers, calling her a rookie, telling her to stay quiet, and laughing along with his colleagues while she sat in silence. What Colonel Harmon did not know, what none of them knew, was that Nadia Reyes was not a rookie. She was not an accidental guest. She was the architect. She had designed Operation Iron Hawk from the ground up, built its intelligence framework, written its mission parameters, and embedded her operational signature so deep into its DNA that the mission could not breathe without her. And the moment Admiral James Carver walked through that door and said her name, the laughter in that room died like a candle in a hurricane. Colonel Harmon did not just lose the room that day. He lost his command. He lost his clearance. And within 6 weeks he lost everything. Now before we go any further, if you were sitting in that briefing room and a decorated colonel told you to stay quiet in front of your peers, would you have corrected him on the spot, or would you have let him dig his own grave in silence? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And if you love a story where arrogance gets exactly what it deserves, hit that like button and subscribe before we even begin, because this one is going to hit differently. Nadia Reyes grew up in El Paso, Texas, in a 2-bedroom house where the water heater broke every winter, and her father worked double shifts at a sheet metal plant to keep the lights on. Her mother was a retired Army signals specialist who taught Nadia 2 things from the time she could sit at a kitchen table: how to read a map and how to keep her mouth shut when people underestimated her. Silence is intelligence, her mother used to say, pressing a finger to her temple. Let them talk. Let them assume. Then let them find out. Nadia joined the Defense Intelligence Agency at 24 after completing a double major in political science and applied mathematics at UT Austin on a full academic scholarship. She was recruited directly out of a graduate seminar by a man who introduced himself only as a contractor and handed her a business card with nothing on it but a phone number. She called it. By the following Monday, she was sitting in a secure facility outside of Arlington being given a background check that took 11 months to complete. She spent her first 4 years as a signals analyst learning the architecture of how intelligence moved, not just what the data said but how it traveled, where it bled, where it could be manipulated. She had a mind that processed patterns the way a conductor hears a full orchestra. Every instrument, every timing, every deviation from the intended score. Her supervisors used words like uncanny in her performance reviews. Her colleagues used words like intimidating. She was promoted 3 times in 6 years, a pace that was not just unusual, it was quietly unprecedented for a civilian analyst at her level. By the time she was 31, she held a top-secret/SCI clearance with access to compartmentalized programs that senior military officers spent entire careers trying to get near. She ran a team of 14 intelligence specialists. She briefed undersecretaries. She wrote threat assessments that landed on the National Security Advisor's desk before 8 in the morning. And then came Operation Iron Hawk. The concept originated in her unit after an 18-month intelligence gathering campaign targeting a mid-tier weapons trafficking network operating across 3 continents with nodes in Eastern Europe, West Africa, and the American Southwest. What made the network dangerous was not its size, it was its invisibility. Whoever was running the financial architecture had embedded shell entities inside legitimate defense contracting firms in a way that made traditional audit trails useless. Nadia had spent 7 months just mapping the money, not the weapons, not the personnel, the money, because she understood, with the precision of someone who had studied every financial collapse in modern intelligence history, that if you followed the weapons you found the soldiers, but if you followed the money you found the war. She built Operation Iron Hawk in a classified document that ran to 214 pages. It covered insertion points, extraction protocols, communication intercept strategies, cover legend architecture, and a forensic financial dismantling plan that would simultaneously expose the network and preserve prosecution viability. It was not just a mission, it was a system, and it had her fingerprints on every single page. When the operation was escalated to joint military execution, meaning it required active special operations forces for the physical components, it crossed desks and eventually landed in the hands of the Joint Special Operations Command, where it was assigned to a SEAL team under the operational command of Colonel Richard Harmon. Colonel Harmon was exactly the kind of man who made a career out of his own mythology. He was 6 feet 2 inches of carefully curated military image, pressed uniforms, a chest full of legitimate decorations from 2 combat deployments, and a handshake that he deployed like a weapon. He had friends at every level of the chain of command and the social fluency to make every room feel like it belonged to him the moment he walked into it. He had also, in the estimation of 3 different Inspector General referrals that had been quietly shelved over the past 8 years, a habit of rewriting operational credit after the fact. He had not designed Iron Hawk. He had not contributed a single intelligence assessment to it. He had received the operational package, reviewed it with his team, requested 2 tactical modifications to the insertion protocol, and proceeded to speak about the mission in every closed-door meeting as though it were the product of his own strategic mind. Nadia was aware of this. She had heard it secondhand from a deputy at JSOC, who found the behavior troubling enough to mention it in passing. She said nothing. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that would become relevant later, and she went back to work. The final pre-mission briefing for Operation Iron Hawk was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a windowless conference room on the E-ring of the Pentagon. The room had a secure projector, a biometric entry pad, and seating for 20. There were 14 people present when Nadia arrived. 8 military officers including Harmon and 3 of his senior SEALs, 4 intelligence community liaisons, and a civilian legal advisor from the General Counsel's office. The 14th seat, the one at the head of the table that everyone in the room understood to be reserved for the presiding officer, was empty. Admiral James Carver, the presiding officer, had not yet arrived. Nadia set her classified folder on the table, opened her laptop, and began reviewing her notes. She was the only woman in the room. She was also the youngest person present by nearly a decade. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, no jewelry except a small watch, her dark hair pulled back with the kind of efficiency that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with function. She looked exactly like what she was. A professional who had been inside this world long enough to stop performing for it. Harmon noticed her when he walked in. He did what men like Harmon always did when they noticed someone like Nadia in a room like this. He assessed her against his internal catalog of who was supposed to be there and concluded, based on no evidence other than his own assumptions, that she was likely a note-taker, a junior liaison, possibly someone's assistant who had been sent ahead to set up the room. He sat down at the opposite end of the table from the empty chair, flanked by his 2 senior SEALs, and opened his own briefing folder with the practiced authority of someone who considered the room an extension of his command. For the first 15 minutes, the group moved through preliminary administrative items. Classification levels were confirmed. Attendance was logged. The legal advisor ran through a procedural summary of international law considerations for the operational theater. Then one of the intelligence liaisons, a man named Douglas Chun who had worked with Nadia's team for 2 years, made the mistake of directing a question about the financial intercept architecture directly to her. It was a technical question about a specific layer of the shell entity mapping that Chan knew only Nadia could answer with precision. "Commander Reyes," Chan said, pulling up a chart on the secure projector, "can you walk us through the Tier 3 entity exposure sequence? Specifically the lag between financial flag and prosecution lockdown window." Nadia leaned forward and had begun to speak, had literally opened her mouth and produced 3 words, when Colonel Harmon held up one hand without looking at her. "Let's hold on the technical details until Admiral Carver arrives," he said in the flat, certain tone of a man who had never once in his career been told he was wrong in a room full of people. Then he turned to look at Nadia for the first time with anything resembling direct attention. "You're welcome to observe, but let's keep the floor clear until the senior personnel have had a chance to establish the framework." He paused. "Rookie." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. There was a ripple of something around the table. 2 of Harmon's SEALs exchanged a glance that was somewhere between amusement and complicity. The legal advisor looked down at his notes. Chun closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Nadia looked at Colonel Harmon with an expression that was not anger, was not embarrassment, was not confusion. It was the expression of a person watching a clock, knowing exactly what time it would reach, waiting with absolute patience for the hands to get there. She said nothing. She picked up her pen, turned to a clean page in her notebook, and wrote a single line that nobody else at the table could see. She waited. The room moved on. Harmon spoke about operational sequencing. He used words like my concept of operations and my intelligence baseline, and the framework I developed with my team. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had said these things so many times that they had achieved the texture of fact in his own mind. Two of the liaisons took notes. Nobody challenged him. The legal advisor asked two procedural questions that Harmon answered partially correctly and partially with confident inaccuracy. Nadia did not correct him. She wrote 2 more lines in her notebook. She checked her watch once. She looked at the door. At 9:14 in the morning, the biometric entry pad beeped. The door opened and Admiral James Carver walked in. Admiral Carver was 61 years old, with the build of a man who had spent his entire adult life in physical readiness, and the face of a man who had made decisions that cost lives and carried that weight without theater. He wore 4 stars on his collar. He had commanded carrier strike groups, overseen joint special operations in 4 separate theaters, and sat on the National Security Council. He was also, for the past 8 months, Nadia's direct point of contact for the Iron Hawk operational handoff. He knew her work the way a conductor knows a score, intimately, precisely, with the particular respect of someone who has seen exactly how hard the composition was to write. He walked to the head of the table, set down his folder, and looked around the room. His eyes moved quickly, the way eyes do when they've been trained to assess a space at a glance. They stopped on Nadia. "Commander Reyes," he said, and the 2 words carried the full weight of recognition, not social recognition, not courtesy, but the recognition of a commanding officer identifying the most important person in the room. "I hope these gentlemen haven't been keeping you from the floor." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, 14 people recalibrated simultaneously. Harmon's face did not change expression so much as it rearranged. The way a building looks different when the light shifts and you suddenly see the cracks in the facade. Admiral Carver pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. He opened his folder. The first page was a cover sheet for the Iron Hawk operational package. In the bottom right corner, in the designated field for originating analyst, was a name. Commander Nadia Reyes. DIA. Clearance TS/SCI. Operation Architect and Intelligence Lead. Carver looked up at the room. "Let's begin," he said. "Commander Reyes, please take us through the Tier 3 entity exposure sequence and the prosecution lockdown window. I want the full architecture." Nadia stood. She pulled up the first slide on the secure projector. It was a financial network diagram of extraordinary complexity. 17 layers of shell entities, 14 financial jurisdictions, 63 identified nodes, and a color-coded sequencing map that showed precisely how each layer would be legally neutralized in what order. It was her work. Every node, every line, every color. She spoke for 47 minutes without notes. She walked through the intelligence architecture with the precision of someone explaining a blueprint they had drawn by hand. She answered every question from Admiral Carver with the fluency of authorship. She addressed the technical concerns raised by the legal advisor with the command of someone who had already run them through a prosecution viability review with DOJ attorneys 3 months earlier. She fielded a logistics question from one of the SEAL operators with a detail-level answer that made the man sit up slightly straighter in his chair. Colonel Harmon said nothing for the entire 47 minutes. At the end of her presentation, Admiral Carver thanked her by name. He turned to the room and said, "What you've just seen is the work that makes this operation possible. Everything else is execution. And execution without this," he tapped the folder, "is just movement." He turned to Harmon. "Colonel, I'd like you to remain after the general session." It was not a request. What happened in the 48 hours after that briefing moved with the quiet efficiency of institutional authority doing exactly what it was designed to do. Nadia had not arranged it. She had not called anyone. She had not sent a single email about Harmon's behavior in the briefing room. She had simply been herself in the room where she was supposed to be, doing the work she had actually done, and allowed the structure to see it clearly. But there were other things that Nadia had arranged. Months earlier, before she ever walked into that conference room, she had known from the moment Iron Hawk was transferred to JSOC execution and Harmon's name appeared on the assignment that there was a risk. Not a risk to the mission. She had built the mission to survive exactly the kind of handling Harmon represented. The risk was to attribution, to ownership, to the institutional record of who had actually created what. She had spent 3 weeks with a government attorney ensuring that her operational authorship was documented at 4 separate classification levels with time-stamped digital signatures. She had an unclassified summary brief registered with the DIA's Inspector General Office that established her role as origin analyst on record before Harmon had received a single page of the package. She had 6 emails from Admiral Carver's office referring to the Iron Hawk framework as Reyes's architecture that were filed, printed, and stored in a document management system maintained by a DIA records officer. She had not done this in anger. She had done it the way her mother had taught her to do everything. Quietly, precisely, before the moment required it. The institutional process that followed Harmon's closed-door meeting with Admiral Carver was not something Nadia observed directly. She learned the details over the following 2 weeks through official channels and from Douglas Chan, who had been in a position to know. The Inspector General referral that had been sitting in an administrative hold for 3 years, the one concerning Harmon's habit of rewriting operational credit, was reopened. It turned out that Iron Hawk was not the first time. The pattern went back further than anyone had formally documented. There were 2 prior operations where post-mission reporting attributed strategic elements to Harmon that the original operational files credited to analysts and officers who had since transferred, retired, or been quietly reassigned. In addition, an operational security review triggered by a separate incident revealed that Harmon had shared a partially unredacted version of a component of the Iron Hawk package with a civilian contractor who did not have the appropriate clearance for that material. It was not espionage. It was the kind of careless, arrogant breach that men like Harmon committed because they had spent too many years assuming the rules were for other people. The security breach was the thing that moved fastest. It was referred to the Department of Defense Inspector General within a week. Harmon's access to classified material was suspended pending review. He was relieved of operational command of Iron Hawk and placed on administrative status. The mission proceeded without him. Admiral Carver formally requested that Nadia serve as the intelligence lead for the operational phase of Iron Hawk, a designation that embedded her in the command structure at a level typically reserved for flag officers. She accepted. Operation Iron Hawk executed over 11 days. The financial network was dismantled across 9 jurisdictions simultaneously. 41 shell entities were frozen by court order. 14 individuals were taken into custody in 3 countries. The weapons pipeline was severed at 4 critical nodes. The prosecution package, built on the financial architecture Nadia had spent 7 months constructing, was delivered to the Department of Justice in a form that the lead prosecutor described as the most complete intelligence to prosecution handoff I've seen in 20 years. There was a formal ceremony at DIA headquarters 6 weeks after the operation concluded. Nadia was awarded the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. Admiral Carver presented it himself. The room held approximately 60 people. Analysts, officers, attorneys, support staff. And every one of them knew precisely what they were honoring. In the photograph taken at the moment of presentation, Nadia is standing at attention in her dress uniform, the medal in Carver's hands an inch from her chest, and she is looking not at the camera, not at the room, but at some fixed point in the middle distance with an expression that is entirely calm and entirely complete. Colonel Richard Harmon's security clearance was permanently revoked 6 months after the IG investigation concluded. The finding included 2 substantiated violations: improper attribution of classified operational work product, and a negligent disclosure of restricted material to an unauthorized party. He was not court-martialed. He was administratively separated from the Navy with a reduction in retirement grade, losing 1 star and a portion of the retirement benefits he had spent 24 years accumulating. He retired to a suburb outside of Jacksonville, Florida, where he spent the first year trying to leverage his military connections into a defense consulting position. 3 firms interviewed him. 2 did not call back. The 3rd extended a conditional offer that was rescinded when the background check returned the IG finding. He was not homeless. He was not in legal ruin. He was something that, for a man who had defined himself entirely by the authority of his uniform and the myth of his record, was arguably worse. He was irrelevant. He was a man in his mid-50s with a resume that he could no longer fully explain to a prospective employer, in an industry where clearance was currency and his had been permanently voided. The last piece of information Nadia heard about Harmon came from Douglas Chan, who had a mutual contact in the Jacksonville area. Harmon had been seen at a veterans event about 8 months after his separation in civilian clothes, trying to introduce himself to a defense contractor's HR representative who, it turned out, had worked in the DA's administrative office during the period of the Iron Hawk operation, and who recognized his name immediately, but not for the reason he had intended. Nadia was in Tokyo when Chan sent her that message. She was at a conference on financial intelligence architecture, presenting a paper to a room of 78 international analysts on a methodology she had developed for tracing multi-jurisdictional asset concealment. She read the message, set down her phone, and looked out at the audience waiting for her to continue. She did not smile. She did not feel the heat of vindication the way people imagine you feel it in stories like this. She felt something quieter and more permanent, the particular satisfaction of a structure that had held, of work that had spoken for itself, of a room 7 months earlier, where a man had told her to stay quiet. She had stayed quiet, and then she had spoken for 47 minutes, and the room had never been the same. She picked up her notes, adjusted the microphone, and continued her presentation. In the front row, a young analyst from the South Korean National Intelligence Service was writing as fast as she could, trying to keep up. Nadia noticed her and slowed down slightly, making sure the next sentence landed with enough space for the pen to follow. Some things were worth being certain the room had heard. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from the work itself but from the constant peripheral labor of being underestimated in the same rooms where the work is being judged. Nadia had carried that weight for 11 years. She had carried it in graduate seminars where male classmates restated her answers louder and received the credit. She had carried it in her early D years when supervisors CC'd her male colleagues on emails she had written. She had carried it in every joint military briefing where she was the only woman at the table and where the table's unconscious consensus positioned her, without evidence, without inquiry, as a visitor rather than a principal. She had never made it a grievance. Not because it didn't cost her, it did, in small cumulative ways that people who haven't experienced it tend to underestimate, but because she had made a strategic decision early in her career that grievance was a tool with a very short range. It was useful for close targets. It had no penetration at distance. And Nadia's targets were always at distance. What she had cultivated instead was a kind of institutional patience that her mentor at the DIA, a retired signals intelligence veteran named Patricia Owens, had described as letting the record do the arguing. Owens had worked her entire career in a world built by and for men who saw her as decoration, and she had outlasted 3 directors, 2 administrations, and every single person who had ever suggested she was in the wrong room. When Owens retired, the Director of National Intelligence came to her ceremony personally. Nobody wrote a speech for him. He brought his own notes. "The record is the weapon," Owens told Nadia on the day she received her first promotion. "Not the confrontation. Not the complaint. Every time you do the work and document it correctly and let someone else claim it without correcting them publicly, you are not being passive. You are loading the weapon. The moment of correction will come. When it comes, it won't just correct the moment. It will correct everything that came before it." Nadia had thought about those words in the Iron Hawk briefing room, in the seconds after Harmon said "rookie," and the room rippled with something that wasn't quite laughter but wasn't quite its opposite either. She had thought about the record, about everything she had loaded into it over the previous 7 months, about the time-stamped files and the registered briefs and the Admiral's emails and the 214 pages with her name in the bottom right corner of every classified cover sheet. She had thought, the weapon is ready. And then she had waited for the door to open. Operation Iron Hawk's legacy extended well beyond its immediate tactical results. The financial dismantling methodology Nadia had developed became the foundation for a classified analytical framework adopted by 3 allied intelligence services within 18 months of the operation's conclusion. A redacted version of her prosecution packaging approach was incorporated into a joint DOJ intelligence community training curriculum. She was asked to contribute to an interagency working group on financial intelligence architecture, a role she held for 2 years while simultaneously leading a new analytical team at DIA that she built from scratch. She hired carefully. She hired, in particular, a number of analysts who reminded her of herself at various earlier points in her career, people who were precise and quiet and overlooked, who had learned to do extraordinary work in the absence of recognition and who carried, in the careful organization of their notes and the particular stillness of their expressions in rooms full of louder voices, the signature of someone who had been underestimated long enough to become dangerous. She told them in her first address to her assembled team on the day the unit was officially stood up, exactly one thing about how she expected them to conduct themselves. Do the work, she said. Document it correctly. Let the record carry it forward. When the moment comes, and it always comes, you won't need to say anything. The room will already know.